And just pleased to see everyone. A lot of familiar faces from Practice Vital community, some new folks I think here as well, which is great. We love to, as many of you know, we love to host Practice Vital conversations with both people using our tool, but also leaders in the broader industry and community who are really thought leaders in the capacity of building well thoughtfully managed teams and implementing a data-first approach to their management. And our team here, Julianne and Poonam, are with the Level Up Leaders organization, a fantastic group of influence and coaching and guidance to the people that they work with. And I'll let you all tell us more about your community and your work. But we're just so pleased to have them here to share a really thoughtful conversation that is so relevant for the Practice Vital world and community in terms of driving really thoughtful human conversations around the work that we're doing, especially when data is sort of at the center of that. So, with that, I will invite you all to say hello and introduce yourselves before we dive into our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madeline. So I'm Poonam, and we've got Julianne here. There's a whole lot of faces on this screen. We are the co-founders of Level Up Leaders, and we're both LMFTs in Southern California. We both stepped into leadership a long time ago, and it was after we had experienced harmful workplace experiences ourselves and some dynamics that didn't feel good to us. And ultimately, what we found is that when we leaped from being therapist to therapist leader, it was much harder than either of us had ever even imagined. Um, and what we found after some time in leadership, after some falling, some failing, some celebrating, and some joy, is that the relationships that we developed and cultivated with our employees and our team members, and the relationships that they developed with themselves really had such an impact on the work. And fast forward 10 years later, we reverse engineered some of what we were doing in our own leadership to bring to creating our Cultivate Trust model. Um, what we found is that even when we need to have hard conversations with our folks, even when we're needing to have hard conversations around data or performance issues, when we have those hard conversations with care, it actually strengthens those working relationships and brings trust into the workplace. So we're hoping to bring some of our learnings and bridge some gaps that some of you might experience in that tension between having those data conversations and holding care for your folks. And I think with that said, we'll dive in, Madeline. Is that okay?
Yes, that sounds great. Would you like me to share from my machine or would you prefer to hold court?
I will absolutely share from my screen here. Give me just a
Perfect.
sec. Julian, is there anything you would want to add while I share my screen today?
No, but we're gonna kind of start by just kind of grounding you all in like a common scenario, which is this perspective of feeling like you have an idea of how one of your employees or contractors is really showing up in clinical space because based on maybe conversations you've had with them, based on maybe um, just the way they talk about their cases, and then when you actually go to look at the data, do you mind going to the next slide?
Not at all.
You realize that it actually paints a different story. You don't actually have the whole picture. And so if this has ever happened to you, this absolutely happened to Poonam and I. And so now that you're looking at this real data, so in this case today, like you said, we're going to kind of walk you through is this idea that you find out that someone actually is holding a 45% retention rate. And so this catches you off guard. This is like the moment where your stomach drops when you find like the data that doesn't match your perception of something. You know, you need to have a conversation about it, but then here's now where like the different stories come up. Maybe you're concerned that this will deplete them. Maybe you're concerned it'll cause like a rupture or they won't be as motivated anymore. Maybe they won't collaborate to your culture in the way they have been. And so you find yourself like putting it off. This is when your supervision is so full and you're like, oh, I'll just like deal with this next week. And then a couple more weeks go by. This might be when other things feel a little more important. But over time, just like for example, if you ignore that sign on your car that says you need an oil change, at some point this becomes an issue because you're not actually able to have meaningful conversations about data that's really important. And so um, we just kind of want to like walk you all through what this like looks like and what it means when you can make data feel actually collaborative and not feel like it's punitive. So then the question becomes like, how do you make, data conversations feel trauma informed? We know that data itself is inherently neutral, and that charge really comes from like when we do attach meaning to it and or the relational dynamics that we have around talking about it. And so many of us learn to associate, I think, data with like that evaluative perspective. Maybe you're just like aware of like power dynamics that are at play. And so you're really holding on to the fact that you're holding someone else's data about their work. It could be the fear that you're going to damage trust. It could be, again, that you're afraid that you'll come across as punitive or reductive. And so, without that psychological safety, it is true that data can sometimes feel like the surveillance rather than a supportive tool. What we would suggest, though, that your hesitation about these conversations probably has nothing actually to do with the data itself, but more about like how to have these conversations and essentially in a way that like builds trust. And so when you approach this data more from like a lens of curiosity and genuinely want to understand what's happening in your whole practice ecosystem, it really does become a conversation starter in a way that like helps growth. And so just like when you're actually responding to that oil change light and go to get your oil changed, it initiates like that action to make sure you do prevent something that could eventually actually become really problematic.
So before we get into the roadmap of how to have this conversation, we want to talk a little bit about rescuing versus empowering. And it's an important um, concept to keep in mind because having data related conversations or challenging conversations as therapist leaders, we sometimes fall into rescuing patterns. And what it is it's our way of easing someone's discomfort or their tension. And what it leads to is taking accountability off of our team members' plates. Often this comes from a place of care because we do care about how our team members feel or how they experience their work. And sometimes it comes from fear. It may come from either a fear of conflict, maybe a fear of someone feeling upset, or maybe even a fear of perception and how we may be seen as harsh. And when we fall into these rescuing patterns, what happens is it unintentionally reinforces this hierarchy where a leader holds power and our team members become dependent on us. It takes away our team members' opportunities to practice responsibility or build resilience or even share ownership around their work. And it can be really diminishing or even create patterns where accountability feels optional. So, if we look at our case study and we're thinking about that clinician's retention rate, um, when I fall into rescuing patterns, I might say, gosh, like I know it's just been such a hard quarter for everybody. Our community is struggling. Let's just not worry about that right now. And the intention might be care, but the impact is disempowerment. And what we want to do is move towards empowerment in these conversations because what empowering does is shifts the dynamic. It leaves us space to slow down. It may make space for autonomy and agency, maybe for struggle as well, but it's holding expectations while we're offering that support. It's trusting your team members' capacity. And what it might sound like is I know that this is really uncomfortable. I know data conversations can be really difficult. And I also believe that you can go through this. So let's look at this together. And this is what trauma informed care and leadership looks like. It's holding accountability and dignity at the same time. We all fall into rescuing. That is absolutely okay. Today, what we're inviting as we go through our roadmap is an awareness. So, notice those moments where you feel pulled to rescue and maybe ask yourself, how can I move towards empowerment instead? And that's how we can shift from that reinforcement of hierarchy to shared ownership. So, this is the 5 step roadmap we're going to walk through, and we're going to go through some core practices within each of these steps. As we go through this, consider maybe a recent conversation you've had around data or one you anticipate having. And when we go through this framework, we encourage you to think about how you might be able to apply some of these strategies to your situation. We'll pause after each step just to see if anybody has any questions or some thoughts. And if we don't get to your thoughts or questions, we have some space allotted for Q&A at the end. And Julianne and I will also drop our email addresses into the chat at the end so that if we don't get to your question, we can absolutely respond to it. And feel free to reach out to us directly.
So first, we're just wanting to conceptualize like where's the inner work or our internal landscape that we need to tend to first before we really kind of construct the language we want to use or the conversation we want to have outwardly with our folks. And so first, it's really getting curious about what is your relationship to data. Poonam and I had to go through this process too. There came a point where we couldn't nurture or inspire our folks enough to actually have them follow through on some of the accountability things that we felt were really important and significant to the work. And so at some point, we really had to get curious about where is this avoidance coming from? Why do we actually feel so nervous or afraid to actually have these? Where did this kind of start? And so it can be really helpful to, on your own, or even if you have clinical leaders, have the conversation around like, what is the story around like, when did the story come that metrics conversations would ever actually damage trust with my team, right? Is there something from my formative years as a therapist? Where this was done to me? Is this something where I can reflect on times when I've seen like peers feel like really depleted when it was used in a punitive way, or if it felt like it was going to be reductive? And so it's really interesting to kind of be able to have a space to just like explore these stories with colleagues that you trust to kind of figure out like, where did this come from? When did we start this narrative? And how can we really get curious about this? Because if you can tend to those pieces that are stopping you from really regularly having these conversations, then it can really like support you and actually being a lot more confident, but also easing into these. So these don't feel like something you just do once a quarter. These are something you like are consistently having. I would suggest weekly, if not daily, depending on like what this looks like for you all in the context of how you have time with your teams. And so after you have space to kind of do the relationship piece and exploring where your data stories came from, the next thing that you really want to get curious about in that internal work aspect is, what are my assumptions about what the data means though? Like, what judgments do I carry about some of this information? What meaning am I actually attaching to this? What are the feelings that arise when I do see someone's retention rate so low, or when I do notice their client sessions are so low? What is coming up for me? And so, if you can get really curious about what those assumptions are, you're not going to be unintentionally bringing those into the conversation without having given your space to really know what are the things. Everyone kind of, I feel like, is different. There's some people who may feel like really responsive to late documentation. There's other people who might find they're more reactive to that retention. And so it's just getting really curious about what that is, and to also distinguish the difference between a systemic factor and an individual performance. I can think of the times when I thought it was individual performance, but it turns out that maybe something in the EHR shifted, and our folks were actually signing notes 2 or 3 times. And it was like, wait a minute, I didn't realize this was actually impacting workflow the way it was. And so it's getting really clear about what that is, and just getting curious about those assumptions. Anything you would add here, Poonam, before we open it up to folks? Any questions here before we move on to step 2? Like any insights or things that you'd want to share specifically about this step? Suzanne?
I think there's a lot of trauma related to numbers, like
Absolutely.
coming up from agencies, and it's
Yep.
just feels like you're a number, and the numbers are just they want to
Yep.
make money. That's kind of like I think where that not where my bias lays that I try to be aware of, but
Uh-huh. Yeah,
yeah.
right. People are bringing in so many of their like past experiences with like authority and different experiences or work cultures. And so you can tell the moment they're like not even in the conversation with you because they're reacting to like old situations that happen. So even when you have like a different intention, it can absolutely, it's like, whoa, where did this happen? We're just really trying to objectively figure out what's happening so I can support you, but it may not be the way it lands for them or the way they hear it. Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. Oh, Bianca.
Hi, I love the self-reflective prompts in this conversation. So thank you so much. I mean, I
Mhm.
had a conversation around metrics a few weeks ago, and the person told me, "You see me as a number. You're only seeing me as a number."
Mm,
So I'd love to understand and just get support around, that there was some projections happening there based on their past experiences, and just support on managing, when those projections come in,
hmm
because those tend to be challenging when you're thinking about this, like, pragmatically and in a supportive way, bringing Practice Vital in and the
hmm
numbers,
hmm
and then you're kind of receiving feedback from the employee related to that that is not based in kind of actuality. So I'd love
Yep.
to just hear conversation around that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think by the end of today, you will like have several things that you can like concretely walk away with and start to name in real time. Because sometimes it's naming it in real time, sometimes it's like the prep work you do to like set up the conversation, which is actually where we're going next, is the like how do you like set that intention? So actually put them,
Yep.
let's go there because I feel like actually it very much reflects kind of where you were just saying, which is when someone's coming in already with this, when they're already seeing it being like a reductive process, if they're just like, oh yeah, you're just
Mhm.
here because you want to profit off of me, right? And you're like, absolutely, like the last thing that's happening in the situation. And so you're able to really set up the conversation to be clear from the beginning. And we'll also get at the end, we'll kind of name all the moments where you might even set all the things up, set the container up for psychological safety. And sometimes they still can't meet us, right? There's still like a way to name that without making them feel like they have to over like share or explain their own internal process.
Mhm.
So I would first say, like, the first thing that we always suggest for folks. So after you've done that internal reflection and you're curious about like the patterns or themes, it's really about, okay, to set up the psychologically safe container, I want to get really clear on what my intention is. And what we mean by this is like, what's the outcome you're looking for or the hope? So for some folks, they might say, my hope is that they take ownership. For some people, depending on context, they might say, my hope is that they know that I see them as a whole human, not just like a number. Maybe it's my hope is that they know that I'm in this with them. And or my hope is that they know this is really serious. It makes me think of all the times where I've gone in to have a challenging conversation and the team members walked away thinking like, oh, cool, I'm doing like great work. And I'm like, oh, I was not clear about the intention and how serious this is. So we need to like try this again. And so on the screen, you see the example here, right? It's my intention is for this to be like an honest conversation that comes from a place of curiosity and recognition of the good work you're already doing. I want you to feel supported, not evaluated. So right off the bat, we're just kind of like sharing what this conversation, how we're going to be moving through this conversation. So then we kind of pivot to the why, right? Why does this conversation matter? Why is this data meaningful? Why do we explain why this isn't just an arbitrary standard or number that we're looking at, but this actually becomes a meaningful data point? And so here's the example we would have, which is my reason for wanting to discuss these metrics so we can identify patterns that might help you serve clients even more effectively and ensure you have the support you need to thrive in your role. So being really specific on where this came from and why it feels important to you all. Anything you would add here, Poonam?
Yeah, there's actually a comment in the chat that I think is beautiful. It's shifting that association from data being about revenue to data being about quality assurance. And when
Yes.
we're talking about the why here, we can absolutely lean into that. If we're talking about retention, well, I know that research shows that having a higher retention rate means that our clients are getting the best care. And let's talk about what it means when we are working on retention improvement strategies. This is meaningful to our community because we want to have lasting support for them. We want some stabilization. And we can get into some of that when we're maybe talking about the why here a little bit.
Mhm. Yeah. So then, in moving through this, we really want to acknowledge what their experience is, right? What is their lived experience, and potentially like to answer some of the things that came up earlier, right? If they're coming and you know that they're already coming from a work experience where these conversations did feel really difficult or did feel threatening, here's an opportunity where you can kind of like normalize that or name that or speak to that, right? And so here is the example of like, I want to acknowledge that feeling uncertain about data conversations is normal, especially when most of us became therapists to focus on relationships, not numbers. And so this is just an opportunity to name that when it feels like appropriate. And depending on who's sitting in front of you, this might look a little bit different depending on all the other conversations you've had. And then we really want to move into a collaborative tone, right? So, what's really like the value you want to uphold in this conversation as you move through it? Because this is just the setting up the psychological container piece, right? We're not even yet really getting into what the number is saying yet. We're just forming the space to move through that. And so the example here is, I'd like us to really center curiosity and compassion as we move through this conversation. And I ask for your openness while we explore these patterns together. So you are setting up the intention. You're able to clarify the purpose or the why, acknowledge their experience, and then share how you want to move through the conversation. And so when you put all of these together, as you can see here on the top part of our screen, this reads, it's actually quite short. You're really just saying like, I have some data that I'd like to share with you that feels really important, and I want us to understand what it means from your perspective. So my intention is for this to feel collaborative, not punitive. I value the care you bring to your clients, and I want to acknowledge that conversations about numbers can be uncomfortable. And so I'd like for us to center curiosity and compassion and really move through this with openness as we review your information today. So this is just like an example how this takes just like a second to set up. But sometimes on the back end, you might be sitting with this and kind of mapping this out for yourself. So with that, I see there's questions. So I'd love to pivot there. Poonam, anyone's that?
I'm looking in the chat right now. I'm trying to monitor the screen here. Um, let's see. From the lens of clinical care, if clients terminate early, it's likely that their goals were not met. From the lens of business, CAC is very high, and it's concerning that some clinicians may not have too much concern if they lose a client, as we will send them another one.
Hmm. Yeah. Um,
What are you thinking?
I'm reading it slower
Be able
I'm
to
like
respond to it.
CAC. I don't actually know what the acronym is, but I think the first thing that comes up for me is like naming this part. So if their thought process is not understanding like the business impact of like what it means to actually, bring on a new client or your marketing process or insurance base, whatever the context is. If they're not aware of that impact and they're just thinking, oh, it's no problem that someone dropped off, I'll just get a new one. I think to your point, it's important to name the client care piece about like what retention means and what does it mean when your numbers are reflecting a certain retention rate. What does that mean about clinical skills? It may not necessarily mean something, but it can. And then the other part is just actually naming like the whole picture, like your whole practice ecosystem. I think it's really important to be able to speak on that. So that's a perfect example of saying that this number is not arbitrary. There's actually meaning behind these numbers that we set. And so we want you to connect to this whole process because it's in all of our best interest to learn this skill, right? Whether folks grow with you or folks go somewhere else, these are all skills like they themselves will need to like grow and develop.
Yeah.
Client acquisition cost. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, that was my post client. So yeah, I like your ecosystem piece because it impacts everybody. If we have to keep
Yep,
getting new people clients, then everybody's marketing expense goes up, the company.
exactly.
So that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think actually talking to them about that from that ecosystem lens, like naming, sometimes like Poonam and I would like actually make images or graphs so people can kind of like have that visual because to them, right, they're just like, oh, this is great. I get a new client. I always know I can rely on my office or the supplies I get, right? And so it's connecting to that to them, not in a way to justify or to have them feel like they owe us, but just that awareness of that impact in the whole ecosystem can really kind of shift that process. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. There's another question in the chat that I think is really important as well, and it's about talking about overall productivity and number of sessions. So even when retention is good, but they're not seeing enough clients, then to some extent the conversation is about revenue because it is about the
Mm.
business. So it supports their pay. And the question is, what would you recommend about how to approach that situation?
Yeah, I think anytime we're naming what the expectation is, it's always going back to like the why piece, right? So like, why is this number been set? Why is it meaningful? Why does it not only support you as an individual provider to be meeting these numbers, but also why it collectively supports us as a practice, right? And so when, for example, we're setting a productivity number, there's going to be a really clear reason why you set that number. Maybe you've set a number so when people are meeting that number, it's ensuring that there's still flexibility that everyone's still going to get like their benefits, the payroll, the extra like other things that you provide. And so I think it's just like again connecting them to whole big picture that when all of these things are met, here's the way that Poonam and I used to talk about it as like the health of the business. Like here are the markers that we know are the health of the business. And so here's the way you're all individually contributing. You're not just like an isolated individual. We're all like really contributing to this. This is kind of like the way we would move through it. What would you add to that, Poonam?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. That's exactly it. It's again going back to that connection to the why. And we're going to get a little bit into this actually in the
Hmm.
next slide. So I'm going to keep us going,
Hmm.
and we definitely feel free to continue to put things in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of these comments and questions as we can. So once we've set this container and set the tone for what this conversation is going to look like, this next step is about being clear on expectations while we're inviting collaboration. The first part of this is wanting to transparently share the data. And as Julianne mentioned earlier, at this point, we're not attaching any meaning to the data. We're just stating some facts. And we honor our relationship with our team members and build those foundations of trust by being clear and honest with them. So maybe you're turning to the Practice Vital dashboard and looking at the trends together because seeing the information together and having the visual is an anchor point. And maybe here is actually even where you further discuss the impact or the ripple effect of the data. Maybe you expand further on why it's meaningful because it might be too much to set that up in that initial part of the conversation, but you get to do it here. So in our example here, it might be saying, I'm seeing that your retention rate's been around 45%, which is lower than our practice standard of 75%. And what I'm concerned about is how this might impact clients' progress in treatment, which is why I want to bring it to your attention. So it's just very clearly stating what that data says without attaching that meaning yet. And once we've shared that data, now we want to invite therapists' perspective on the data. It's not about inviting their perspective on the standard. We're not inviting them to say, oh no, our standard should be 60%, not 75%. It's inviting their perspective on what this data means. What are the insights they have about the patterns or the barriers? And this is where we really ground into curiosity and start painting that maybe black and white drawing into a very colorful picture. In our experience, what happens when we open up this way is that our team members might be able to share factors with us that were invisible before. Maybe there's client cancellations due to some insurance change that we're not aware of. In fact, that just happened to me recently. I have a client who all of a sudden dropped off and wasn't scheduling, but I had no idea that their premiums had gone up and their copay had gotten so high. My retention rate dropped a little bit because of a certain insurance panel. Maybe there's some other systemic issues around scheduling that we're not aware of yet. And so when we're inviting this therapist perspective, they might be able to give us information and clues. It's maybe saying, I'm really curious about this number. Does this surprise you or does it align with what you're noticing? Can you help me understand what your clients might be experiencing or what your numbers might be representing? And what are some of the patterns that you're noticing? We're really also then inviting some empowerment here versus jumping to conclusions and assuming what this means about these numbers. So when we get to this, putting it all together here again, it's not a whole lot that we're saying. We're just saying, your retention rate caught my eye. This is what I've noticed. I'd love to understand what this means for you. And uh, we've left these integration practices on the screen. So when you come back to look at these slides, you can use these questions to maybe help craft your script if you're needing to write it down prior to engaging in a data conversation. And we'd love for you to be able to use these. But for now, we'd love to hear any questions that you have around the inviting collaboration piece when you're sharing data with your team members. And Julianne, are you seeing any comments in the chat here?
Not since step 3.
Yeah. Any thoughts on inviting collaboration?
I have a quick question. I was curious how you guys handle, I find that in this stage, a lot of people's defense mechanisms come out. And they can they start to point to like how we have created this problem for them. I'm curious how you handle that.
Hmm. That we've created the problem of
Like retention,
tension. Uh-huh.
retention or whatever the number problem is. Like I have this example in my practice right now. And so the thought was like, I'm getting bad clients or you guys have done this. It doesn't, it's hard to get collaborative when people's defense mechanisms come up.
Hmm. Yeah. This might be naming the defensiveness if we're noticing it as gently as possible. Oh, I'm noticing that um, you might have some thoughts actually on why this is occurring. I wonder if you could share with me some of your, actually, we're going to get into our next step. Actually, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, right? I'm wondering if you could share with me some of your ideas on how to navigate that. And Julianne, do you think I should just move into the next step because it's
I
attached
think
to
it
this?
answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. So, sometimes what happens when we start inviting collaboration and we start getting perspective, we have something to work with. And so maybe they are being defensive, maybe they're saying you have caused this, but maybe they're noticing that there are barriers to scheduling because of limited availability on their calendar, or like I said earlier, insurance or financial barriers. And what we can do is identify here if there's an individual performance concern that we need to address, or maybe a systemic issue that we need to address. And if our folks are identifying that there might be a systemic issue, we're inviting them into this conversation. So we might say, okay, so I see what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I see these patterns. I have some ideas here on what might be supportive, but I'm actually curious what your ideas are. It seems that you have some thoughts about what we might be doing that might be contributing to a low retention rate. I wonder if you can share with me what your ideas are on potential solutions here. And this really even goes back to this idea of rescuing versus empowering. If I'm responding to their defensiveness from a place of fear, I might want to problem solve or fix or even defend my own position. But what we want to do here is empower them and create space for them to stretch a little bit and offer them an opportunity to share that perspective and ideas on how to improve. Um, they might be able to share something that we're not seeing systemically. We've definitely worked with group practice owners where once we start looking at that feedback and peeling back some of what's been shared, there's a systemic concern. Maybe it's around um, time and availability because we're working with kiddos in our practice, but we're trying to schedule them earlier in the day when they're in school. And what are the systemic factors that might be impacting retention and scheduling when working with children? Maybe we're talking about um, concerns around maybe a BIPOC therapist holding a caseload of all maybe white clients, and how does that impact retention rate? And maybe there's a systemic issue that we need to consider here. And what are maybe our therapists or team members' ideas on how we address that a little bit? Julian, what would you add in regards to that?
Yeah, I think to regarding Ashley's question, I think
Mm,
it's important to ask them to take accountability for their part. And I also
mhm,
know that it was easier for me to say those things when I know I at least felt like I took accountability of mine. And so it
mhm,
might be naming, like in my case, I was aware that sometimes I was pointing out their productivity numbers, but was not actually filling their caseloads right away. And so I would go into that specifically naming that piece first. Like I want to name or own my part. I'm like, let's look about where your part is. Because even if I haven't maybe given you like the new clients that you need, if you're still not meeting or seeing the clients that are currently on your caseload, there's still like data to really have like real conversations about, right? So I think it does help to own as much of your part that feels appropriate, not to like overly take on their stuff, right? To Poonam's point about the difference between rescuing or empowering, we're not overly taking responsibility. We're not trying to make this comfortable, but it is owning our piece in hopes to model for them to own theirs. And that then becomes easier to actually say, like, I'm also wanting to see which part feels like yours to own. So we can like talk
mm,
through this. I know this is my piece to own. So how are we going to like kind of work through this together? So I do think that
mhm,
helps like ease or give a little more comfort into that process.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Any additional thoughts there before I move into this next step here?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. So once we've invited our folks into this conversation and really asked them to identify ways that they might also be able to improve their retention rate, maybe their productivity numbers, whatever the data is that we're looking at, we want to establish a follow-up plan, and really identify how we're going to check in on progress. The mistake I often made is I would have these conversations and I would think that everybody's going to go along their merry way and follow through with whatever plan that we have created for improvement. But what it doesn't do is close the loop on the conversation, and it may perpetuate that data from maintaining the current rate versus actually improving. So we want to look to see how we are going to track that movement and how we're going to see if it's moving in a direction we want it to go or need it to go. Um, this is also for us to be able to see if there's additional barriers that pop up and how we're going to address those. So, what does that follow up look like? When are we going to follow up? How are we going to follow up? It might be weekly in a supervision to see if the team members actually utilizing those strategies that we identified. It might mean pulling up that dashboard and those metrics and looking at that data together in a month and seeing if there's been any changes, and then getting curious again, going back to that, collaboration step of what does this data tell you? What are you noticing? We're seeing some improvement here. What's contributing to that improvement? We're actually seeing this stay the same. What do you think is keeping it the same? Or maybe we're seeing a decrease. What do you think is happening here? Let's really investigate this. And so, how do we want to communicate when we're going to follow up? And be very clear on saying, okay, well, next week in supervision, this is how we're going to look at this data. And we don't want to assume that there is going to be improvement here. We want to create those steps to follow up on that instead of just making those assumptions. So if we put it all together, right, in this co-creation process, it's I have some ideas on how we can improve your retention rate. I'd really like to share those with you. I'd really love to hear what your ideas and thoughts are. And let's follow up next month or next week so that we can see how these strategies are actually working for you. In hearing this part of this roadmap, we're curious what comes up for folks, and feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute yourself.
Yeah, so in the comments, there's definitely like some validation about like it's helpful to like name when folks have a hard time taking ownership. Also, the exhaustion to feel like you're always having to have these conversations. So just validate that having these conversations over and over again is actually so very normal and not an indication that you or them are not doing a good job. It's just truly a part of leadership and practice ownership. What I would say is to the specific question, it's in this, like doing this in an empowerment model, how do you help when they have no idea that they're even having an issue?
Mm, yeah. I think, what's hard is it's having to point that out and it's having to be
Hmm.
honest and saying that this is a problem and this is why it's a problem. It's naming that as clearly as possible. Um, and that sounds really cut and dry, perhaps, but I think it's explaining to them why this is a concern and how this has an impact on them, on their clients, on the community, on the practice. What would you add there, Julianne?
Actually, clarify. She said, sorry, not that they're having, but that they don't know why. Are you saying like they're not sure, like why, for example, like their retention rate low, so they don't have like that insight, I imagine is essentially, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think in that case, we're asking them to get curious and we're walking them clinically through what that might look like. And so I think depending on the context, this would look different, right? And so is starting to set them up for how are we going to um, because we don't know why this is happening, now is our opportunity to get curious, right? And so now is where we're wanting to get more information to understand what's happening or what's contributing. So clinically, how are we going to move through this? Is this an indication? It depends on the context again. Is this where they're going back to try to map out what can the data really paint a picture on? Is there a certain point? Is there a certain session where things are dropping off? Is it with a certain diagnosis? Is it a certain demographic? Like what are the things that we can get curious about, both from a data perspective, but also from a story perspective. When do they start to notice they're not feeling confident in their clinical skills? Is it feeling like, oh, I've run out of all the interventions I want to do? Where is that coming from? And then sometimes it might even be you calling up those families or those people who dropped off, right? And so that there's going to be moments where that's appropriate, where you're needing to actually get a little bit more information. But I think if they're not sure, that's just an invitation to go deeper and lean into like that curiosity piece.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah. Let's see what else is in this chat. Yeah. See the exhaustion again.
Mhm.
I have a new hire pre-licensed therapist who hasn't taken our feedback to please not book clients outside dedicated work hours, resulting in clinician canceled rate to be beyond our expectations. We put him on a performance improvement plan because he was blaming and not taking accountability with our feedback, which is unfortunate. Yeah. And we get to reflect that back, right? We're noticing that this cancellation rate is high, but we're also noticing that the scheduling is happening outside of working hours. hmm Yeah. You notice anything else in the comments that we want to address here? I think we've got it all. Okay. Oh, is there ever a point where you give them full access to their data rather than always providing it to them? I think absolutely. I think that
Mhm.
it is really empowering for them to have their
Mhm.
data and they ought to be looking at it. There was a
Mhm.
time in our leadership where we were actually asking our therapists to pull up their own data and bring it into supervision
Mhm.
after having reviewed it so that they could present it to us and share with us what they were noticing about their data and share with us what they plan to do if there were improvements needed or even to celebrate the wins. And that feels really good.
Mhm.
Yeah. How much time do you give for an improvement plan to be made? What happens if it doesn't change? I think that context matters here. It depends on what kind of data we're looking at. Some data we want to see an improvement in within a month. Some data might be and might require a quarter to be able to see the change. It's really having to evaluate what's needed for your practice, and perhaps even comparing it to other folks. You might be looking across team members and seeing how long does it take for folks to improve these numbers and using that as a baseline. Um, and then what was the other part of that? What happens if it doesn't change? It's naming and noticing those patterns. I'm noticing that we've talked about these numbers. It's been 3 months. I'm noticing there is no change. Let's talk about that a little bit. And that could mean or lead to maybe inviting another team member. If you've got a leadership team, maybe another team member might be able to provide other strategies or another perspective here. Maybe we're looking at another support plan here that hasn't been considered. Maybe we're seeking consultation because we're stuck in how to support our folks. And is there somebody else who might be able to offer a perspective here? Julianne, what would you add if we're not seeing improvement?
Naming time and also chat.
Ah,
So I feel like
yeah,
just wanting to, I don't want to leave anyone hanging, and I know
yep.
we have like a couple more things to get through. So I think
hmm
that was a beautiful response and beautifully answers
Yep.
like that process.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
want to help everybody.
So we should hopefully have a couple more minutes at the end to try
Yeah.
to flag some of the questions. I think it's really important to name that even when you set up the intention and you're very clear on the purpose and you actually thoughtfully go through this work, there are still going to be moments when ruptures happen and repair is needed. Not because it's a data conversation, but because you're two humans moving through conversations that sometimes can have historical meaning for them, right? And for yourself. And so just want to name that like repair is never failure when you have to do repair. And in fact, there's so many times when the rupture would happen and I would think, oh, this is it. They're gonna like quit or, they hate me, whatever that story is for you. And so more and more times though, when I would be honest about my intention and the hope to repair, it actually really strengthened the working relationship. So first of all, like some of you have actually already kind of named, which is like be on the lookout for what the cues are that are needed, right? So it could be in real time that you're noticing this, and it could be after the fact, right? Have they started to avoid you a little bit more? Did you wake up the next day and something just like didn't sit right with you in the way maybe you responded because you got frustrated during the conversation? Are you aware that during the situation you or them got activated, maybe both of you? All these things are okay. Again, just normalizing you're human. It's human to not want to have these conversations. It's human to feel frustrated that you have to keep having these conversations. And it's very much like something that is part of the work in which we do. And so it's okay to name that tension. And so here's some examples of like, how do we name defensiveness, reactivity, or shutdown? And so, like, I notice you might feel uncomfortable, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think you need to know your person. Some folks maybe really appreciate it being named in the moment. Some may actually need that space. Sometimes I knew I was too upset to name it in the moment, so I would even maybe name that like, oh, I'm noticing I'm having a lot of stories. We've had this conversation several times, and I'm feeling like I'm not sure how to explain how important this is to actually evoke the change I'm hoping to see. So I'm going to pause this for today. I need to think about this, and I'll circle back with you tomorrow. And so it's okay to name those in real time and actually speak to it so you can actually get to the actual work in the data itself. And so this other example, I noticed that our conversation last week felt charged, and I just really wanted to check in with you about it. How is that sitting with you? How was that experience for you? On the next slide, we have a couple more examples of what this could look like, of either noticing tension in real time and or reflecting on conversations from the past. So you can definitely come back to these slides if you rewatch this to kind of just like get perspective on some language you can use to really name in real time or after the fact. Anything you would add here, Poonam?
Mm. Yeah, I think I guess what I would add is it's important to pay attention to those signs or those signals that tell you that that rupture may have occurred.
Mhm.
And I guess I'm just echoing what you're saying here. It really does strengthen that working relationship when we can come back to it. I think that's the difference between perhaps or how we maybe heal the trauma around our past
Mm.
experiences and what this looks like, right?
Yep.
Because we're open to bringing in that process of repair and addressing the dynamics that are occurring when we're having these hard conversations.
I'm in this with you, and all you can do is invite them to join you, and just know that sometimes they're not going to be able to accept that invitation, and
Mhm.
that's not necessarily a reflection of your leadership. It just is a reality that sometimes we can't meet each other, and that's okay. But it doesn't mean that you have to somehow not say the hard things, right? We really want to honor what your internal response is. So when the resentment visits, what is this telling me? I need to really make sure I share a need or a boundary or expectation. If something else is kind of showing up for you, again, another invitation for you to really like practice these conversations and start like being able to move through them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, we have a few minutes where we can absolutely do some Q&A. Again, feel free to unmute or drop questions into the chat, and we'd love to be able to answer them.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at Kate's question.
Ah,
It says, I'm curious if you see any need for a different approach from the leader if they're like a clinical supervisor versus a manager or practice owner in these conversations.
I would say no, it's the same approach. We want to follow that five-step roadmap still. We want to set the container here. Um, we want to transparently share the data, invite that collaboration. What I would say would be potentially different here is if you are the group practice owner, it would be empowering the clinical leader or the supervisor to have that conversation, but to maybe have that conversation between the group practice owner and the clinical supervisor first to talk through all of the maybe stuck points, right? Is there a story here that we need to address and navigate and reflect on before you go into the data conversation? Let's maybe anticipate or plan for if you get stuck in the conversation, what are you going to say or do if your team member maybe has some defensiveness around this. What's the plan here? How do we align on this conversation so that when you're going into this conversation, you know that I'm in the room with you, even if I'm not actually present in the room with you. So I think that what's important here is as a leadership team aligning before
Hmm.
going into those challenging conversations around data. What would you
Hmm.
add?
Just seeing like the in the chat, the just acknowledgement about different ways to give access to your folks to like see their own data. And I will say there was a huge shift for us when we really empowered our folks to again own their data. So rather than it was like this power thing where we had their data and we were going to share it with them, it became this empowering thing where they got to be able to access and look at their data and then come to us and share their thoughts or feedback or curiosities. And so it did shift that in a way that felt actually really empowering, and allowed for folks to really feel like they owned that part of their work in a different way that changed the dynamic. So just
Mhm.
wanted to like affirm everyone in the different ways that they're doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. To the comment about the drop off in folks looking at data, even when it's provided, something that I had to learn how to do was be consistent with my agenda and my supervisions and ensure that we talked about the data or ensure that we created a corner to address any metrics related conversations. It was so easy for me to talk about do client consults. It was so easy for me to do a human check-in because that's really important for me. And sometimes I would not want to talk about the data. So creating sort of an agenda where we talked about the data first was really helpful. And that promoted the consistency in them looking at their data versus dropping off and looking at it. Yeah. Any other questions here?
Looks like a question
Practice vital
for
question for
mhm,
Madeline. Yeah.
mhm.
Oh, I'm sorry. I see this. Okay. Practice vital question. I've noticed the longer time frames give higher retention rates and shorter time ranges show lower retention rates. Any thoughts about the best time frames to use? Should we be using both longer and shorter time frames to catch current issues? Yes, I think exactly sort of where you're headed is toggling between a few different time frames to paint a picture for what those retention numbers really look like. Obviously, you'll get richer sample sizes when you do a larger time frame. So if you go back a year, really, you can kind of see more intakes or more first sessions that are going into that calculation. So it kind of gives you, in some ways, a larger sample size that's more meaningful. When you look at too short of a time frame, you're just seeing one slice of, new clients coming in. So it might not be always directionally indicating a bigger picture issue or strength for that matter. So definitely play around and see, seasonality, even in the retention report, you can see month to month how those things fluctuate now. So that might also help you understand, is there a seasonality to this? Is there a longer term trend? And really try to make a story out of the numbers when you look at them in context. Great question.
Uh, so
And one more, do you
oh,
adjust retention rates in your practice when insurance is lost or clients move out of state? That's a great question. I think that's more of a, nuanced question depending on your, relationship with insurance and those clients that are moving in and out of state. So hard to answer that at a blanket level. But I would think also the numbers, even within your practice, might show a trend that you could learn from and or glean some insight from that might inform whether to adjust your retention rate accordingly, unless others in the group have experienced something like this.
Well, we've dropped our emails in the chat in case anybody wants to reach out to us directly. We are more than happy to answer questions. We love to get to know everybody who we could come into contact with, even in a large space like this. And we appreciate you being here. Julian, you want to share a little bit about our like takeaways?
Yeah, I think just knowing that trauma informed leadership doesn't mean avoiding the hard conversation.
Hmm.
So giving yourself permission and really bringing in your humanity into accountability and know that you don't have to lose your humanity by holding someone accountable. And so when you approach it with that curiosity and that care, they get to keep their dignity and you get to actually move through these hard conversations that actually build trust versus being afraid it's going to break it. So just want to really encourage you all. That in this process, it does get easier when you're able to like really use a framework that kind of helps guide. And
Hmm.
thank you all so much for your questions
Yeah.
and engagement.
Yeah. Thank you for being here.
What a great conversation. Thank you so much for hosting with our group. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
Yeah.
thank you for
Thank you for
having
having
us.
us.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care. We will circulate the recording and field any additional questions via email. Take care. Have a great weekend.